This is 4.5b, convert fractions to equivalent fractions with the LCD or least common denominator from OpenStax PreAlgebra. So if you remember before, we have converted fractions into equivalent fractions. And so we know that 1/4 is equal to 3/12. And we can show that graphically here, right? This is 1/4 and it's equal to 1, 2, 3/12. So those are equivalent fractions. We also know that 1/6 is equal to 2/12. Those are equivalent fractions, and here we see that 1/6 is equal to 1 2/12. Okay, so those are equivalent fractions. Now, when we find equivalent fractions of two different fractions that have different denominators, okay, so one has a denominator of 4 and one has a denominator of 6. When we find equivalent fractions of two fractions that have the same denominator, we have 12 here and 12 here, that's called the least common denominator. If we find the LCM, the least common multiple of 4 and 6, and use that as the denominator, it is called the least common denominator. So you can write that on your notes, least common denominator. Okay, so it's the lowest number that is a common multiple of both of them. Now, if you end up with something that is not the least, but it is common, you generally will still be able to work with it. You'll just have to reduce later. So it's always beneficial to find the least common denominator. So let's define, or not necessarily define. We've already learned this, but let's think back to the equivalent fractions property. So the equivalent fractions property says that if A, B, and C are whole numbers where B does not equal 0 and C does not equal 0, then A divided by B, or A over B, is equal to A times C over B times C, right? If we take any fraction and we multiply the top and the bottom by the same number, then we end up with an equivalent fraction. Okay, and you can go the other way too. A times C over B times C is equal to AB. Okay, so you can go either direction. You can divide both sides by the same number to get an equivalent fraction, or multiply, not both sides, but the top and the bottom. You can either divide the top and the bottom by the same number to get an equivalent fraction, or you can multiply the top and the bottom by the same number to get an equivalent fraction. So to add or subtract different fractions with different denominators, first convert each fraction to an equivalent fraction with the least common denominator. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is you have to find the least common multiple of the denominators and then convert the fractions so that they each have the least common denominator. So let's put it in list form, how to do this, how to convert two fractions to equivalent fractions with their LCD as the common denominator. First you have to find the LCD. So at this point you're just concerned with the denominators. You don't care what's on top. You just want to find the least common multiple of the denominators, and that is the least common denominator. Next, for each fraction, determine the number needed to multiply the denominator to get the least common denominator. And I know that's a lot of words. When we put it into practice, it'll make more sense. Okay, so you're going to determine the number needed to multiply the denominator to get the LCD. And then 3, use the equivalent fractions property to multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the number you found in step 2. And this is so important. Okay, just like in an equation, whatever you do to one side, you have to do the other side. The same thing is true with a fraction. What you do to the top, you have to do to the bottom. Okay, you have to keep it equivalent. So you must keep them equivalent by doing the same thing to the top and the bottom. And number 4, simplify the numerator and the denominator. Okay, you always want to make sure that you have your fractions in simplest form. So let's do some examples and see what this looks like. Example 4.65. Convert 1/4 and 1/6 to equivalent fractions with denominator 12, their LCD. Okay, so they've already given us the least common denominator of 4 and 6. So the least common denominator of 4 and 6 is 12. Okay, they gave that to us. If you need a refresher of that, that was either, I think that was the previous lesson, 4.5a. You can go back and check out 4.5a. But let's go through the steps. The first step, I'm going to go ahead and write the step numbers. The first one was to find the LCD, and they gave us the LCD, so the LCD is 12. And then the second step, this is where there was a lot of words, and I said it would make more sense once we do it. The second step was to find the number that you have to multiply the denominator by to get to the LCD. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask ourselves, what do we have to multiply 4 times in order to get to 12? Okay, so 4 is our first denominator, and we're trying to change that denominator to 12. So what did I multiply 4 by to get to 12? And so the answer there would be 3. Okay, now I'm going to just leave that there for a moment. I'm going to come back to that 3 in a little bit, but now I need to do the same thing with the 6. Okay, that's my second fraction, my second denominator. So I'm going to put 6 times what is equal to 12. What did I multiply the 6 by to get to the 12? And that answer is 2. Okay, so I'm going to work with this 3 when I'm changing the fraction 1/4 into a fraction with 12 as the denominator. So if I multiplied the bottom times 3, remember, to keep it an equivalent fraction, I have to multiply the top by 3 as well. Remember, 1/4 times the same thing on the top and the bottom is still equivalent to 1/4. So then I just multiply across. 1 times 3 is 3. 4 times 3 is 12. Okay, so now I have a fraction that is equivalent to 1/4 but has a denominator of 12. Now I'm going to do the same thing for 6, but instead of multiplying them both times the top and the bottom by 3, I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 2. 1/6, and I already said that 6 times 2 gets us that denominator of 12. So I need to do the same thing to the top. I need to multiply the top times 2 as well. 1 times 2 is 2, and 6 times 2 is 12, and so this is an equivalent fraction to 1/6 that has 12 as a denominator. Okay, try it. You are going to try this on your own. So you're going to change to equivalent fractions with the LCD. Okay, so you're just finding the equivalent fractions. You're not adding them or subtracting them. You're just finding the equivalent fractions. So the first one, 3/4 and 5/6, and the LCD they give it to you is 12. Oops, sorry. Is this it? Yeah. Okay, so the 3/4 and 5/6 and the LCD is 12. Okay, so you're going to do that one first. And then -7/12 and 11/15, and the LCD is 60. Okay, so pause your video and then come back and check to see if you did it correct. So let's look at 3/4. In order to get from 4 to 12, I'm going to figure out what I multiplied by, and that answer is 3. And then I'm going to work with the 6. 6 times what? These happen to be the same ones as the previous one, and that answer is 2. Okay, so I'm going to do 3/4, and I multiplied the 4 by 3 to change the denominator to 12. So I also need to multiply the top times 3. What's done to the bottom must be done to the top to keep it equivalent. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 3 is 12. So this is an equivalent fraction to 3/4 with a denominator of 12. Now I'm going to work with 5/6. 5/6, and I already said I'm going to multiply 6 times 2 to get 12, which means I also need to multiply the top times 2, and that's 10/12. So 10/12 is the equivalent fraction to 5/6 with 12 as the denominator. Okay, let's move over to the next one. -7/12 and 11/15. and we're trying to get 60 as the denominator. So 12 times what equals 60? And that answer is 5. And then 15 times what is 60? Equals 15 times what equals 60? And that is 4. So then I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom of the first fraction by 5. Now don't let this negative scare you. You're still just going to, you're going to have a negative, and like I said, we can move that 7 or that negative up to the 7 if you want, if it makes you feel more comfortable. I personally like it on the top better. But I'm multiplying the top and the bottom by 5. So negative 7 times 5 is negative 35. And 12 times 5 is 60. So negative 35/60ths is the equivalent fraction. You could also put that negative out in front. Okay, now I'm going to multiply 11 over 15 by 4 on the bottom and 4 on the top, so that the bottom becomes 60. 15 times 4 is 60, and then 11 times 4 is 44. So 44/60ths is the equivalent fraction to 11/15 with a denominator of 60. So check your answers, make sure you got it correct. If not, go back step by step and see where you went wrong. Let's do this one. We have 8/15 and 11/24, and we're going to change them to equivalent fractions with a denominator of 120. So now we're working with a bigger number. Okay, but don't let the fact that it's a bigger number scare you. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to say we're going to use 15 and 24. Okay, so 15 times what is equal to 120. 15 times what is equal to 120, and that answer is 8. And then I'm going to say 24 times what is equal to 120. Now, of course, it might take you some time to figure these out. You might need to do some division, but just for the sake of time on this lecture, I'm just going to tell you that this is 5. 24 times 5 is 120. Okay, so now we need to multiply both of these by the original fractions. So 8 over 15, and we're multiplying the bottom and the top by 8, and that is equal to 64 over 120. 64 over 120. Now we're going to do 11/24, and we're multiplying the top and the bottom by 5. We already know that the bottom is going to be 120. That was our target denominator. 11 times 5 is 55. So 55 120ths is an equivalent fraction to 11/24 with 120 as the denominator. Okay, 2 more try it problems. Go ahead and pause the video and then come back when you think you've got it. So first, let's go ahead and figure out what we multiplied 24 by to get 96. So 24 times what is 96? The answer is 4. And then 32 times what is 96? And that answer is 3. So I'm going to multiply 13/24 by 4 on the bottom and 4 on the top, and that is equal to 52/96. So 52/96 is equivalent to 13/24, but it has a denominator of 96. Now I'm going to multiply 17/32 by 3 on the top and 3 on the bottom, and that is equal to 51/96. So now these two have the same denominator, 96 on the bottom of both of those fractions. And the last one, 28 times what is equal to 224? 28 times 8, once again, this would take you some time, but I'm just, for the sake of our time here, I'm just going to tell you that it's 8. And 32 times what is equal to 224? And that's going to be 7. So I'm going to multiply 9/28 by 8 on the top and 8 on the bottom. 9 times 8 on the top is 72, and the denominator is 224. So 72 224 is equivalent to 9/28. and then I'm going to multiply 27 30-seconds times 7 on the top and the bottom, and that comes out to 189 224ths. So that is an equivalent fraction to 27 30-seconds with a denominator of 224. So go ahead and check your answers. Go to Google Classroom for your assignment. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me or leave me a comment.